flashing lights warning immediately as we transition worlds, as has been the trend, because, oh boy. Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Donkey Kong 94. In the last part we cleared through Worlds 5 and 6, and now we're in World 7, the Iceberg. This is what I think is generally the fan least favorite world in the game, but I generally just like the airplane less. The main gimmick that we're going to see in a lot of the levels across this world in general is these little ice blocks. Largely, they're indestructible, except when it comes to these little fire enemies that have a name I don't know. When they walk across it takes a second and then they completely melt. When there's just one of them, it's pretty easy to figure out, but when you get to the point where you're unleashing 2 or 3, things can get a little unpredictable, as the collision when it comes to enemies walking around floors, especially ones that destroy or gates that you yourself open or close, it can get a little funky real quick, honestly. To a point where you might end up just having to wait an extra second here because, for instance, the ladder right there on the left. It looks like I can climb up that, but the thing is with ladders in this game, you can climb up them, but you can't actually leave the ladder from the top unless there's a platform directly above it that it connects to. So while that looks like a platform I could have maybe used, I actively could not reach the top of that platform because that ladder on the left didn't actively reach the top of something. That limitation has always felt weird, but given that this is ultimately a puzzle platformer, I'm not going to complain about it too much because that's ultimately just part of the puzzle at the end of the day. Being an ice world that's in Iceberg specifically, though, we're also going to be dealing a lot with water, and I don't think we've really seen that too much at this point. I think it's maybe shown up in 1 or 2 levels along the way, and I haven't really talked about it. When you're underwater, you mash the A button to swim, as is normal. However, there is definitely a little bit more of a weight to Mario underwater than there is in some other games. But at the end of the day, the biggest threat underwater is usually enemies that can just kill you by contact damage. However, what is more of a threat is that when you're carrying a key, you just sink like a rock. And the key, should you throw it in water, will also sink like a rock. So for instance, the hazard in this level isn't so much losing the key to death, it's losing the key and having to wait for it to respawn up here and having to come back up here. Keep that in mind with the moving platforms on these tracks and the moving ones along the water's edge, and you already have enough of an issue. But the thing is, with things on the water's edge like these ice pieces here, they do slowly sink when you're on top of them, so you need to mash the jump button, do short hops to keep them high enough in the water that you can reach the door pretty safely. But the next level in specific is one of the more unique ones in the game. I think it's one of only 2 that do this. We've had stages with a lot of doors. Now it's time for a stage with an invisible door. The door is there on that block we just saw Pauline's screens coming out of, but we actively can never see it. So half the challenge here is actively getting the key and then remembering where the cry was coming from to actually leave the level. What you can try to do in this level is to use the spring or the block that's to my left to actively offset where the walruses are, and I recommend doing that because that means they'll now walk around the entire perimeter of the room. Which means they might be a bit of an annoyance in some other places, but when it comes to the more hazardous platforming over the actual deadly spikes, every little bit can help, honestly. I definitely had a practice attempt here where I just tried to bum rush everything here, and I got all the way to the second to last jump there, but I was a little soon on it and I ended up getting pushed off. And I believe when you get pushed off by enemies like this, you also automatically drop the key, so you need to watch out, because yeah, that is a bit of a thing. There are some enemies that would kill you normally that when you touch them when you have a key, they don't kill you outright, you just drop the key and get stunned. It's not every enemy, but there are some. Usually it's the ones that attack by just trying to push you off of things as it is. And honestly, in some cases, they're more likely to kill you like that than they would be normally. So the first Donkey Kong encounter stage here is a bunch of elevator platforms going up and down. These are not ones you can actively reverse because there's not a switch here. The real danger is twofold. The speed that the moving platforms actively move at, because it is pretty fast and easy to lose track of, and these blocks here that work a lot like the thwomps from mainline Mario. When you get below them, they actually slam down. We've been seeing these throughout the game to begin with, I just haven't really talked about them. But the one I'm standing on right now is placed really dickishly compared to a lot of other things in the game because there's no way you can see it coming ahead of time. So unless you just happen to miss a jump and have to jump back to the left, you're probably going to get killed by that more than likely. And it's one of the few times in the game where it really feels like they kind of blindside you like that, like without any other way around it. I don't like that. So for the next third of the world, we're getting a new mechanic, icicles that are on the ceilings of certain portions. When you get below them, they fall down. However, when they're in the ground like that, until they fade away after a few moments, they are treated as platforms, so you can use those to get across certain gaps you otherwise wouldn't be able to, but you also need to keep in mind that they are timed. Now, most of the time they're around, the timer lasts long enough that's not an issue, but there might be the occasional moment where if you're not rushing, that can be a bit of a problem. Also, just gotta say, I like this game's soundtrack on the whole. It's not my favorite soundtrack from the Donkey Kong or Mario series, but it's generally nice. This song, I do not get why it's as ominous as it is. This feels more like, this is gonna be a bit of a weird comparison, the song that plays before a boss fight in Castlevania Rondo of Blood? I don't know why that's where my mind goes, but it is, and So, let's go back to talking about the game's staff. We've actually already talked about most of them at this point, because this is an early enough Game Boy game where there's not a very large team involved. There's only 3 roles left, namely Special Thanks, the main illustrator, and the manual editor. And the special thanks for this is Shigeki Yamashiro. Their first role listed is as a staff member on F-Zero, both in the arcade and on the NES, but then they did some 3D tools for the original Star Fox, they were on technical support for Stunt Race FX, they were a debugger on Earthbound. Generally special thanks on a lot of the major Mario games in the period, as well as Donkey Kong games like Donkey Kong Country 2, Donkey Kong Land. Pilot Wing 64, they were a project arranger. They were a voice in Killer Instinct 2 of all things, as well as Killer Instinct Gold. But as of their more recent roles, they were still in the special thanks for Donkey Kong Bonanza. They were a staff member on 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. Special thanks for Snipper Clips just in general. Co-producer on Mario Maker 3DS. Executive producer on Mini Mario and Friends Amiibo Challenge. Mario vs. Donkey Kong Tipping Stars on the Wii U. They were an executive producer, as well as Mario and Donkey Kong Minis on the Move on 3DS. These roles are a little varied, but that's because he was generally a programmer early on, but he, I think, became eventually the president of Nintendo Software Technology for a good bit there, but I think he left that in the early 2020s? Nintendo Software Technology being a first-party developer for Nintendo that I think specifically made things like Prime Hunters, the Mario vs. Donkey Kong spin-offs, some of the Wave Races, and I think they worked on Crystallis on the Game Boy Color specifically. After them is the main illustrator for the game, namely specifically when it came to 2D illustrations for concept art or anything regarding promotional art or in the manual, Yoichi Kotabe. If you're familiar with a lot of the Mario artwork from the 80s through the mid-2000s, you're probably familiar with work they've done if it's not Miyamoto or some of the 3D renders. I think they started technically doing a couple of sprites for Doki Doki Panic, but then they became a motion designer for Mario 2 USA, did printed artwork for Mario World, Mario 3, I believe A Link to the Past they did, Mario Kart, Mario and Wario, Super Mario All-Stars, Link's Awakening, this, and they continued working, doing artwork like that until, I think, Mario Power Tennis on the Wii was the last time they were listed. Partners in Time, they did illustrations for Mario Party 7, they did graphic support for Super Princess Peach, they were a character supervisor. They were largely involved in a lot of the illustrations. In specific, I believe, Kotabe is the one who designed Princess Peach's dress that she's effectively been wearing since Mario USA or Mario 3. And they had some role in, like, codifying Bowser's design. I forget exactly what, though. Future Me will probably chime in more with that. And while I think they left Nintendo in, like, 2007 or 8, they are still involved in artwork and animation. Specifically, I think they're a freelancer that's done stuff with Toei Animation, which they were at before they were at Nintendo, specifically. The last person listed in the credits, though, is Atsushi Tejima, who is the manual editor. They largely were involved in manual artwork or PR in some regards across their career, starting on manual editing for Mario Kart. They did the same on Star Fox, and they were on this. They were a screenplay advisor on Mario RPG. They were a manual coordinator for the Japanese manual, specifically on Mole Mania. After that, they were in a lot of special thanks sections like Pokemon Stadium and Paper Mario until Mario Tennis, where they're listed as being part of the PR team. Wave Race, Blue Storm, same deal. Artwork support for Mario Kart Super Circuit. Artwork for Doshin the Giant, which I believe was that giant yellow guy GameCube game that was Japan only? Yeah, that's what that is. And then they're in the special thanks for Superstar Saga, Mario Party, E for the e-reader, they were on graphic support, and their last credit was Donkey Kong Jungle Beat as a person who contributed some artwork. What I do kind of find interesting about this game's development team, specifically all the people from PAX Softnica, is that it shows that second-party developers have always been pretty important alongside third parties, but also that Donkey Kong in general was kind of just handed off to second-party developers even prior to Donkey Kong Country. And there's something about that I do find very interesting. Actually, thinking about that in that regard, it's kind of weird thinking back, but this is also one of the last times we really saw Donkey Kong look like this for a good while. Because I think within the same year or the next year is, I think, when the first Donkey Kong Country launched, and after that, the Rareware design for Donkey Kong became pretty much the standard until the Mario movie? And, well, hey, Bonanza's kind of tried to combine the best of both worlds in that design, and honestly, I do really like how he looks at Bonanza a lot. I'm not sure when I'm going to get another chance to really talk about Bonanza, but that game's really cool. I don't think I'm going to pick up the DLC anytime soon because the DK Island thing looks pretty small and cute, but the roguelike mode doesn't really interest me because I'm not really generally into that as a genre. It was pretty interesting seeing them actively design a game that's that heavy of an action platformer, as you don't really see Nintendo do that outright, as their platformers, especially starting from, like, I'm gonna say probably New Mario Wii, were comparatively pretty safe until probably Mario Odyssey, which even then only really had a couple of moments of active difficulty and danger that felt like I was actively constantly at risk. Even though ultimately I still thought the game was on the easier side, that's just because I'm used to a lot of other games being harder. That game could still easily kill me if I let it, which it's nice to see. Also, the soundtrack kicks ass. Also, it's absolutely gorgeous. Seeing Nintendo games rather, at 1080p without any kind of like emulation feels weird and wrong. This level took me a weirdly long time to figure out on my first run, if only because for some reason it just didn't click with me that I had to set these platforms to move up and then ride the icicle down. For some reason in my head on my first playthrough, I just couldn't separate in my mind that I could stand on top of the icicles when they're on the ground and when falling. In my head, for some reason, while they were falling, they were just a constant hitbox. I think that's probably tied in some other game I played where it's a hitbox until it's in the ground kind of deal. But I don't know, that's just one of those things where, like, my instincts told me to stay away from it, and largely, I know I can trust those in games, sometimes not so much, it really just depends on what I'm doing. This is also one of a few levels that happen across the game where even if I'm not going for the bonus items to get bonus extra lives like this, I often do just on accident because of where they're placed along the actual progression of the stage. There's not many of those in the game. I'd say maybe mostly 5 or 6 out of the over 90 levels, but when it happens, it really does throw me off. This is a stage that at least builds off what we just saw pretty well. We actively need to use the falling icicles now as the platforms to get higher up, and the timing on this can definitely be a little bit weird. Partially because you do want to just use standard jumps to get on top of these, as it's the most direct arc, but because of how small Mario's default jumps are in terms of their height, it just feels a little off. Plus, it also builds into something else I haven't mentioned when it comes to the ladders yet. Just like how you can't get off a ladder unless there's a platform at the top of it, you can't get onto a ladder unless you're standing on the floor. And in 2 cases in that level, you need to stand on top of the icicles for that to count as the floor. This is the other notable level here, where the door is completely invisible. However, it's also levitated a good 8, 9, 10 tiles in the air. You really need to memorize where it is and just try to feel it out otherwise, because if you're not directly on point here, you're actively not going to technically clear the stage. Because similarly to the ladders, if you're not standing on a floor in front of a door, even if it's invisible, you're not actively leaving through it. So we need to actively place the road, I think is actually what the item's called, like it's roads and ladders specifically are what these are called, directly below where the door is, which is about like a tile and a half, 2 tiles to the left of the platform where the switch is that we just activated. If I hadn't put that platform there, I think I would have died. There is thankfully one thing you can do to make this level a little bit easier on you when it comes to figuring out where the door is, and that's notably, you can't place items like springs or platforms on top of the door. So right there, that error sound means I was directly on top of it, so by placing it one below, I know I'm at the right altitude, so I can just get on top of this spring by placing a platform right there, right next to it, and get up to there and actively leave the level. It's levels like this where, as much as I really do like Mario vs. Donkey Kong as its own sub-series, I really wish this specific game, instead of mechanics, got its own Mario the Lost levels or Second Quest type deal where there's just more of it with more intense levels and maybe more varied boss fights specifically. As I feel like there's a lot of untapped potential in this mechanic set in a 2D puzzle platformer sequence. And again, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, especially the first one, does a lot to fulfill that, as it has a lot of the same general ideas, but its own set mechanics with the minis as objectives and all that. And it is pretty much close to the same thing, but because it's also the first game, again, in its own regard, its difficulty curve feels like it goes backwards. And actively in that regard, I've actively never checked to see if there's maybe like ROM hacks to this to maybe lead into like harder levels more soon. I feel like that would be an interesting thing to look into. With that said, we're now done at the Iceberg, so it's time for us to move on to World 8, which is the largest world in the game, far and away, with I think 16 levels to itself. With that said, we're also coming up on another world transition, so flashing light warning once again. It is pretty rough, especially considering I have the game zoomed in to not have the in-game Super Game Boy border there. If I honestly did have the game zoomed out and just had that, I wouldn't probably be warning you every single time, but because we're going full screen on this, just to prevent issues, you know? Yeah, 16 levels, far and away the largest world in the game, and ultimately making up about, what? I think that'd be like 17 point something% off the top of my head of the game's levels, so closing in on a fifth of them. This being the largest world, they're going to throw some of the hardest stuff in the game at you. And they do a really good job, I think, in this world of balancing the difficulty from the pure level design standpoint, but also actively using the enemies as obstacles themselves, and not just as damage sources patrolling around an area. Like, the idea here in this level specifically is really neat, where you need to just throw the key away to actively reach it, and then grab it to get to the door. Like, a lot of the early game levels in this very much come down to get to the key, take it to the door, or find a way to get key to door. You actively needing to abandon the key in some levels, I think, is some of the more interesting things, because it actively adds a secondary time limit on top of the actual time limit, which I don't think I've even talked about that, being a time limit in a game, period. If that runs out, it's a death. I think at most I've maybe died to a time over 3 or 4 times in the game, and it's either in larger levels or levels where there's already a pretty strict timer. Similarly to mainline Super Mario Bros. Though, like the timer, it's in seconds, but it's not actually in seconds. Largely, you have more than enough time in any given level. A pretty noticeable trend throughout Rocky Valley's stages, though, is that when they're not outwardly more puzzle platformy stages, they're gauntlets that you have to run through with the key to get to the door, usually with a bunch of projectiles, enemies that can kill you in one shot as it is, or other hazards in your way that can seem a little weird when you compare it to where we start the game level design-wise, but it does fit pretty well with as late in the game as we actively are. This is a stage I don't think I've ever done the proper way. You're meant to go around the long way to get to this key, but if you just mash the A button like nothing else, you can get over here, hit this switch to open up the door, grab the key, and then go down the water this way to completely ignore upwards of like half the level. I believe the purse is on the left side. Yeah, it is. So if you're trying to get all the bonus items for some reason, that's there, but not much point in doing that at this point, considering I already have max lives. And this isn't one of those games where they show 99 but count past that, because there are several games like that. Heck, I don't even think I mentioned that about Banjo-Kazooie. I believe in that game, you can go above 9 lives, and it just doesn't show it until you actively go below 9, period. This is another Donkey Kong encounter where your own progress is largely tied to whatever Donkey Kong himself deigns he wants to do, as the lever next to him will open or close these floor gates, allowing you to progress up here to either swap this lever to the on state, actually opening the gate to the end of the level, or actively being able to climb up to him to begin with here on the far right. It's not a very long level, but I've definitely had times where it feels like he just takes his time actively swapping that switch. But again, this is one of those games where, since the timer is seldom a threat, I'm actively never really looking at it, so I'm not even sure if there is, like, a pattern to when he'll actively press the switch. Like, it's every, like, 10 to 20 in-game seconds or something like that. I've just never really checked. I'm assuming future me can probably spot something about that in doing post-script editing, if that is the case, but I feel like it is largely random. So now for something I technically talked about much earlier in the LP, it's time for us to start seeing falling rocks. Like I mentioned all the way back in part 1, I believe, even. If one's falling from above you, you can enter a handstand, and your feet will actively protect you from the rocks and any damage they could do to you. With that said, unlike barrels, you can't pick them up and use them as items after that, so you really just need to kind of feel out what you gotta do there. With that said, we're not doing anything with that immediately. It's time for us largely to actually deal with doing some more Super Hammer stuff. If there is something that's a little bit iffy in this game, especially getting used to it, it is small gaps that you can actively fall through, because while Mario himself can't walk through small gaps because he's 2 tiles high, even though he doesn't look it, his width is actively counted as 1 tile wide, so you can fall through those. But it took me a little bit to actively realize that, as just because of how other games, especially Mario, tend to make it work, in my head, he's 2 tiles wide, and I just always assumed that was the case. So I would actively go out of my way to break more blocks than I actively needed to, actively leading to sometimes getting a little tight or being a little bit risky when it came to getting a little close to enemies like that. Thankfully, because I was carrying a key, that wasn't an instant death, but as you can see, they definitely timed the animation for that to be long enough where you're likely to start losing the key. Also, it's probably already pretty clear because of the timestamp left in the video and how many levels we have left in the world. Rocky Valley is far and away the largest world, as I've already mentioned, to the point where it's also the only world in the game we're having to split into 2 different videos. This is actually a game I wasn't sure how it was going to come about in editing because the levels are so quick I easily could have done 15-minute videos, but I think when I was doing that, like the final video ended up being weirdly short or weirdly long because of the ending and all that, and I was like, let's just go for as close to 20 as we can on each one. And doing that, well, that led to this being the way it is, and that's just how it's got to be. This is a level that for some reason I tend to pull weirdly close in a couple different ways, as in order to finish it, we need to come up here, flip this switch, go grab the key to our west, ride the platforms down, and then throw the key up and hit that switch below me in order to open the gate back up. And it is largely just because of the spider enemy that I talked about I find weirdly annoying earlier in the LP. They move fast enough, I guess this one's technically a scorpion, they move fast enough where even if I feel like I'm playing optimally, I feel like I'm cutting it a little too close to their hitbox. Now, that would be obviously fixed just by maybe, hesitating a moment and waiting for them to get past, but something about this game just really makes me want to go fast in it, and I do not know exactly why. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 5, we're going to go finish off the game. See you guys then.